Hey, what's up everybody? It's Dan Pickett, co-founder at Launch Academy here to bring you another episode of the HTML show. We're diving into the fundamentals of front-end engineering, and today we're covering our exploration and expansion on cascading style sheets in CSS. And if you remember, in last episode we were using inline style sheet rules using the style attribute. Well, today we're going to be focusing on using the style element, which is going to go in our header tag, and I'm going to show you and demonstrate what that looks like in today's episode. We're also going to study this idea of isolating particular elements on our HTML web page using CSS selectors. And in particular, we're going to pay close attention to our class-based, ID-based, and element-based selections. And we're going to end our discussion around incorporating special CSS 3-based selectors, pseudo selectors, direct descendant selectors, and children selectors. And we're also going to round out our discussion talking about the importance of naming conventions and keeping consistent IDs and classes in the context of our HTML documents. So what I've gone ahead and done is I've gone and cleaned up the page that I've been producing over the last 5 episodes or so, and made it look pretty. And I thought before we dove in that I would just share with you some of the tools that I used to make this page a little more attractive, and what were some of the things that I thought about when I was selecting my color scheme and my fonts. So first, I want to just point you to a wonderful tool put out by Adobe called color.adobe.com. And this color.adobe.com handles a lot of the what's known as color theory for you in terms of finding good themes in color schemes for your websites. And what I did actually to make my page kind of blend and look semi-decent, of course it's still very simple, but at least the colors match well, is I used this color tool, and I started with this pink value that I retrieved off of the launchacademy.com website. So I went in and I right-clicked here and I hit inspect, and using the computed tab of the Chrome inspector, I was able to get the color and plug it into my style attribute for every H2 in my document. So we're using that H2 style, and we've used that color, and I plugged that color into the color wheel here to get the rest of the colors that I can incorporate into my HTML web page. And we won't cover too much color theory here, but essentially what Adobe Color CC does for you is it applies math to the color that you input to basically give you complementing colors, and just colors that the human eye tends to see as wonderful sort of pairings to make for an attractive looking website. So designers will use this color theory when considering a brand's color or a website's color, and I highly recommend you checking that out. The other tool that I have installed here on my browser is called the Eyedropper Chrome extension. And if you just Google Eyedropper Chrome extension, you'll be able to go ahead and download that and install that. And there's a couple of different ones. You should try each one. But essentially what it allows you to do is basically hover over different websites, for example, the launchacademy.com website. And let's go ahead and refresh this page. And use the eyedropper. And I can go ahead and just pick a color from the web page. For example, maybe this blue that we're using here, and now that will be available to us in the palette. So there are different tools with different UI, but the idea is to use a color picker tool that allows you to very easily kind of explore color patterns and color schemes on sites that you like the design of. And you can use the Adobe Color tool to basically find nice colors to accompany the color that you've selected. So that's what I've done here, and I've got a semi-decent looking website. I mean, it's not particularly pretty, but thus far we're using all the tools that we've learned in the past 5 episodes, And I've applied a color to my H1 tag, which is the most important tag on the page. And this hex code, if that looks unfamiliar to you, I recommend go back to the previous episode where we talk a little bit about this color theory in detail. But basically, the last 2 digits here show us that we're strongly in favor of blue. So the first 2 digits are red, the middle 2 digits are green, and then the last 2 digits are blue. So we can see this hexadecimal combination is greater than 12 and greater than 9B. So we're going to get a predominantly blue color for our H1 tag. And likewise, I used the H2 hex code tag that I got off of the Launch Academy website to basically make my H2 tags look pretty as well. I also set my background color to a subtle RGB based combination, and again I used Chrome Inspector to extract this color from the Launch Academy website. But we can use this hex code, which you'll see most consistently and commonly across web pages. But CSS also supports different color measurements. So here we're using the 255 scale for red, green, and blue. So this is the decimal version of essentially this representation of hexadecimal color. So there are different ways that you can qualify a color. The Adobe Color Wheel does a great job of showing you the RGB calculation and how that correlates to the hex code valuation. There's also hue, saturation, and brightness that you can set using CSS as well. But more commonly and most commonly, you're going to see your color formats in either RGB or hexadecimal format. Most frequently, most predominantly in hexadecimal format. The CMYK color scheme tends to be more oriented around print because those are the different inks that contribute to a color printout. So digitally, you're always going to be dealing primarily with RGB and hex value color codes. But having a familiarity and an understanding of all of the available color schemes and color coding schemes is important for you to become a great CSS developer. So that's why I've included this RGB code in here. Now, we talked about a little bit of a problem as it pertains to the style attribute. So here, if you notice, in order to get all my H2 tags to be the same color, I had to manually plug in the style so that it matched that pink color for every single H2 in the HTML document. This is a problem if I want to tweak that color, if I want to retheme my website, and just in general maintain the beauty and integrity of the document here. So if I change this color, for example, by even one sort of decimal here, watch how drastically this changes. Now my goals is out of sync with the rest of the H2 tags, so I have to go and replace this in every instance of using the style attribute. So the style attribute is a very limited way and offers us limited functionality as it pertains to being able to apply universal styling to our HTML web page. And you can imagine as we produce a series of HTML web pages, how this gets even more hairy if we update one particular document versus a dozen documents. Now we have to go into each in every document, change every single H2 tag that occurs, and that just creates a real scalability problem for us as developers. So there's got to be a better way, and thankfully there is. So enter the style element. So the style element basically gives us the ability to apply universal styles to our HTML document. So the style element typically belongs in the head tag so that we can apply all of those CSS all of the CSS rules when the document is loaded. And when you're inside a style element, you can use a more verbose CSS language to basically define your rules. So for example, if we wanted to define this rule for the H1 tag, let's take a look at how we would do so. So first, we're going to define our selector. And in this case, we're using an element-based selector that basically says for every element H1 on the document below, I want the following CSS rules to be applied. So I'm just going to take everything that I put in that style attribute, and I'm going to cut and paste it into this H1 tag. And notice Adam is doing us a favor again in trying to provide us with some great CSS syntax highlighting so that we can see what this looks like from a CSS syntax standpoint. So notice that we're still using the colon and semicolon syntax, but what we're doing here is, like our HTML, we're taking advantage of the white space to basically demonstrate that these CSS rules indicated on lines 12 through 14 should be reflected only for elements that are of the type H1. So we're applying this rule to every H1 element on the document. So we've deleted that inline, as we call it, inline style attribute here in the H1, and we've moved it or refactored it to be included in the style element as we've defined here. And we're using a CSS selector, in this case an element-based selector, to basically define the rules that we want to apply to every H1 tag on the HTML document. And then we've specified 3 rules in CSS to reflect the type of styling that we want to apply to every H1 element. Now notice that we're using curly braces in this style, where we specify the selector, then we have an open curly brace, and then we tab all of our CSS rules inside that selector, and we close the whole selector here with a closed curly brace. So this is basically our way we can display visually that these rules are subservient to the H1 selector that we used. And we're going to use this pattern and basically refactor all of our style attributes, our inline styles, to utilize the more scalable, better designed, more usable style element here. So let's just quickly save our document here and see if there's been a change to this H1 element that we have at the top of our page. We refresh it, and though we've moved the style attribute from the H1 tag and we've refactored it to the style element, because we duplicated the rules, the document itself, when viewed in the browser, actually appears unchanged. So we're just going to go through that same process for the rest of our elements here. And along the way, we're going to explore how we can use additional selectors to qualify the CSS rules that we're setting. Okay, so we're going to use another element-based selector for the body to basically set the background color and the font family. And as we discussed in the previous episode, it's also important to set a base font size. So we'll stick to 14 pixels. So we've removed the style inline attribute, and we've refactored that body tag to make use of an element-based selector. And our text size increased a bit because I'm kind of enlarging the text here for your benefit. But essentially what we have here is the body styles applied. And we can actually look at that using the Chrome Inspector. And we can hover over the body tag in the Chrome Inspector. And what's really cool is we can see the CSS rules that we've applied and how that is actually designated on the HTML document. So we see here that on line 11 of our HTML document, which correlates to where we see it in our Atom editor, we see here that we're defining 3 rules, just like we have in our CSS that we've defined in the document. And what's really cool about using the Chrome Inspector in this way is we can toggle styles on and off. So notice how my background color is changing as I check and uncheck that particular rule. So we can use the Chrome Inspector again as kind of an interactive tool to play around with some of the CSS rules that we're setting. Cool. The other thing I want to point out is very early on in the course, I shared that every browser has its own opinion and perspective on how certain elements should be styled. So in techno speak, we call that the user agent style sheet or the browser style sheet. So every browser is going to define some default behaviors for the element styles that we have. And it's up to us as CSS developers to override those defaults. And most web developers will use what's called a normalize or a reset style sheet. And we'll link to those in the resources. But a reset or normalized CSS is going to basically kind of munge all those user agent or browser-based opinions and try to get you on a common baseline across all different browsers. So let's actually see, because we don't have a normalized CSS or a reset CSS applied here, let's actually see if there's a bit of a difference between how Chrome is rendering our CSS and how Safari is rendering our CSS. So you can see that because of the user agent style sheet, there are some important differences between the way Safari is incorporating and integrating our document and how Chrome is incorporated and integrating the styles of our document. So later I'll show you, one of the most popular is just called normalize.css. And you can incorporate this into your HTML document to basically bring all of the browser-based or user agent style sheet opinions into one common baseline. So it just helps you provide for a more consistent browser experience using a normalize or a reset style sheet. And as we progress in the course, I'll show you how to make that happen. All right. So we've talked about how we can set element-based styles. Now let's also talk about how we have this duplicated H2 style here. So I want to centralize each of these stylings using an element-based selector. So remember, though we've only been dealing with one body tag and one H1 tag, these styles are being applied universally to the HTML document below it. So when I set an H2, and we'll just throw a text decoration underline in here to demonstrate the effect. Watch what happens to all my H2s in the HTML document. Now every single H2, even the one that I've discolored, has an underline on it. So we can take this color that we've applied and also put it in our selector, and we're designating this rule inside the curly braces. Really important that all your CSS rules go inside the curly braces of your selector. So now I can remove all those redundant rules. And this makes it easier for me as the web developer to maintain. It makes the page less heavy to download. And just in general, it's just a better way of stylizing our web page. So I'm going to go ahead and just remove all of these style attributes. And though I've removed all of those style attributes, because I've applied this H2 relationship, now every single H2 on the page is going to have that color pink. And it's also going to be underlined. Now watch what happens if I toggle some of these rules in the Chrome inspector. So if I toggle text decoration, because I've specified a very kind of wide scoped selector, it's going to apply or unapply the underline to every H2 on the tag, on the HTML document. So we use element-based selectors to kind of provide far-reaching stylings on the semantic markup that we produce in our HTML document. Cool. All right. So we talked about the element-based selectors. Now, there are also additional selectors that we can use to get specific about the content that we're using. So, for example, this paragraph is important or different from a styling standpoint than the rest of the p tags that I've used in the HTML documents. So I can assign a special ID to this paragraph and isolate this specific paragraph using an ID Based Selector. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this p tag, and I'm going to call it lead. So when you're writing journalistic documents, or you're writing a news article or whatever, we call that introductory sort of first sentence or first couple of sentences the lead. So I'm going to use that to basically indicate that this is the first paragraph on my HTML document. And what I need to do is I need to figure out a way to isolate this particular paragraph tag. And if you've been paying attention to the previous episodes, you know that an ID can only exist once on an HTML document. And to isolate this using CSS, we're going to provide a pound-based selector here. So this is the CSS way of expressing for any element that has the ID lead, indicated by the pound sign and then the ID name, we're going to apply the following style rules. So we're going to go ahead and just copy and paste these and format them this way. And we've got a question in Slack. I'm going to check in on that in just a minute. So watch what happens now that I've moved that styling over to an ID-based selector and remove the inline style. Hopefully, we shouldn't notice a change in the nature of the actual style of the document. And we haven't. So we've successfully isolated this top paragraph, and we have not affected any styling changes to the other paragraphs on the page. So we use ID-based selectors to call out a specific element, a single element on the HTML document. All right. So Christine has a question. If I'm trying to change a color of one word in my H1 that I've used in a selector for, will it override my span style? That's a really great question. So there's a couple different ways that you could do that. If you notice, I'm using a strong tag here to basically isolate the text Dan Pickett inside the Hi, I'm Dan Pickett header tag. And we're going to talk about how we can use nesting relationships to isolate specific tags on a page. So to jump a little bit in the progression here, what I can say is H1 strong. I could change this color to reflect that pink color that we're using in the H2 tag. So what I'm saying here from a CSS selector language is any strong tag located inside or nested in an H1, apply these CSS rules. So this is basically a way of describing a nesting relationship where I only want to apply this coloring to strong tags that exist within the H1. So let's check that out and see what happens. So because I'm very specific about wanting to attach that color to the strong tag inside the H1, the coloring changes and the pink is applied to the strong tag that is around Dan Pickett. So that's one way that you can isolate and change text within a block level element. We can also use class-based selectors to isolate this particular strong tag. So if we wanted to call this the name, then we could isolate strong tags with class name, and the same styling would be applied. Now, if you remember from previous episodes, we can have many elements with the same class. So if I wanted to highlight, for example, my dog's name as pink, and I wanted to highlight Apple's name as pink as well, watch what happens. So not only now is my name pink, but now my two dogs' name is pink as well, because I used a class-based selector prefixed by a strong tag to basically say for all strongs with class name, I want the following color to be applied to it. And we can see how that's applied in the Chrome inspector again. And we see that in this case, we're dealing with a strong that has class name, so apply this color to that strong. Now, really important caveat here is watch what happens if I try to apply the same thing to my daughter's name. Notice that the color doesn't change visually on my daughter's name. And the reason for that is because I've specified here that I only want to apply this color to strong tags that have the class name. So we can use a combination of element-based selection and class-based or even ID-based selection to basically isolate specific elements on the page. If I want to apply this color to every element that has class name, I can remove this prefix and just use the dot to basically say, for every element that has class name, I want it to be pink. So watch what happens when we do that. Now that we've reduced or eliminated that element-based selection, anything that has class name is going to have that pink color to it. So we can go ahead and actually add that to Shannon as well, my wife's name. And we can see that that will now be pink. Now notice that because I qualified these with classes, any other strong or EM tags are just going to have default browser behavior in terms of how those are displayed. So we can use the combination of element-based selectors, ID-based selectors, and class-based selectors to basically isolate specific elements on our HTML web page and apply the desired styling so that we have consistent aesthetics and consistent look and feel in the context of our HTML document. Now let's talk a little bit about the importance or the specificity of each of these types of selectors. So one of the beautiful things about cascading style sheets is that we use the specificity of CSS selectors as a way to determine what rules should be applied. And the always winner is always going to be the ID-based selection. So if you want to apply specific styling to a single element on a particular page, you want to use an ID-based selection. It's going to be the most efficient from a browser performance standpoint, and it's going to be the most specific from a CSS standpoint to basically point to and isolate a single HTML element on the page. Class-based selectors are second in specificity, and we can qualify those like we saw with element-based selections, and that's going to allow us to qualify at a weaker layer of specificity, but we can still use it to disambiguate between different strong tags in the context of our HTML document. And then the weakest selection is an element-based selection. So it's super easy for me to override the color of my document. For example, we'll just make it red. If I specify a more specific CSS rule. So we say in cascading style sheet language that this has a higher order of specificity than this. So because of that, this red is going to be interpreted as more important than the style that's applied to the less specific selection. So let's go ahead and save this and see what happens. Now my H1 tag is showing that bright color red, right? But notice too that my strong tag here is still pink. And that's because we're applying that specifically to the strong tag within. So that particular relationship, if we see here strong class name, has a higher order of specificity and it's deeper in nesting. So this rule is going to apply. And we can kind of see that relationship using the Chrome inspector again. So if we right click on the page and we look at our H1 tag, we can see the cascading nature of style sheets. So the first thing that's going to be ruled out is the user agent style sheet. It's just going to automatically be overridden by what we've set, maybe in our body tag or whatever it might be. But notice that in the case of our H1 style rule, that this is crossed out. And what the Chrome inspector is trying to tell us here is that there's a more important rule, or a more specific rule, that has taken precedence over this H1 color setting. And we can see that the rule that is being applied is the color red rule that we created with the more specific CSS selector. So it's really important to understand the nature at which style sheets cascade, and that's the C in cascading style sheets, is the more specific rules that we use and the deeper in the nesting that we go, the more likely our style rule is to be applied. Cool. All right. So let's continue to make this page a little pretty. We're going to remove this. That was for just demonstration purposes. Now that we have this tool set in our sort of toolbox, we can start to rely less on the default stylings that the browser has for us, and we can instead utilize CSS to get the effect that we want. So if you remember, we use the EM tag in our footer to basically give the default browser behavior of showing this text in italics. And we can see that in the browser-based experience. Let me just bring this up so that you can see above the watermark here. All right, so see here how we have this text in italics. Well, with CSS, we no longer need the EM tag to apply that effect. And we can have better emphasis or better sort of structure or semantic structure around our page because we can remove the unnecessary markup. We can apply the italic style rule without necessarily having to add emphasis to this particular copy. Maybe from a search engine standpoint, the search engine doesn't necessarily care about the copyright, so I don't want to add the emphasis tag here. I just want the italic effect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new P rule, and I'm going to set my font style to italic. Now take a moment and before I hit refresh, consider what may happen when I refresh the page, what this may look like aesthetically. And I'll go to the top of the page and refresh here. Notice now I've gotten some unanticipated consequence of the change that I've made. Now my paragraph tag at the top and all of my paragraph tags in the HTML document are now in italics, which is less than ideal, right? I only wanted to apply that to my footer element. So I can use a special selector that are, these special selectors are available to us as early as, I think, the second version of cascading style sheets. But we can utilize sort of the relationship that the P tag has with the footer to isolate only the paragraph tag that exists in our footer tag. And we do so using this syntax. So this is the CSS way of saying, for every paragraph that exists inside a footer element, apply these CSS rules. So now that I've appropriately qualified my bottom paragraph to be the only paragraph that appears in the footer, and I've applied that CSS rule properly here on line 40, now my font style will be italic. And then no longer is this paragraph text in italic, and no longer is this paragraph text all in italics, right? So because of using the nature of CSS, I've appropriately qualified my CSS selection here to only apply this styling to the P tag that exists within the footer. Now, this is pretty general. So, for example, if I put this P tag inside a div tag, that rule is still going to be applied. I can use a direct descendant selection to basically say only P tags that are directly nested under the footer apply this style sheet rule. Watch what happens to my footer at this point. Because I put my paragraph tag inside a div, this CSS rule no longer applies because P is not a direct descendant of footer. If I wanted to make this work, given the existing markup, I'd have to supply the entire chain. And of course, this is a pretty specific selector. We're going in 3 layers of nesting to qualify this style rule. So you can use a direct descendant to get even more specific about the markup that you want to apply style sheet rules to. Cool. All right. So we've got that. Let's actually work a little bit with our navigation list here. So I want to basically call out this nav element as a sort of special section on my web page. So if you remember, we've got kind of this ugly default unordered list here. So what I want to do is I really don't want this important links to break and then have a list. So we're going to play around with the default styling that the user agent style sheet is applying to my H3 tag, I believe it is, in my UL tags here. So what we want to do is we're going to go up to our style element here, and we're going to say, okay, well first, I want to make my background color, we'll make it close to black, right? And I want to make the color of my text white. And I want to make the weight of all the text bold. Watch how this applies. So now I've applied the color and I've applied the font weight. Notice how it adjusted my unordered list. Okay, cool. Now I want to say for my H3, I'm going to set the default display to inline block. An inline block is kind of an intermediate behavior that we can set using CSS to basically give us some block level behaviors on our H3 tag, but also some inline. So it's kind of a marriage of the two concepts. And we use inline block display to kind of demonstrate that we want this item to appear by itself, but we don't want it to clear on the left and right of it. Watch what happens when I set this. Now my important links is behaving a little bit differently, but what I need to do is I also need to apply similar rules to my UL tag and my LI tag here. So we can chain selections here to basically say for every H3 under nav, for every unordered list under nav, and every list item under nav, I want to set the CSS setting display to inline block. So not only can we get specific with our CSS selections, but we can also kind of conjugate our CSS selections to basically identify multiple selectors to apply style rules to. So we use a comma here to basically separate the H3 under the nav, the unordered list under the nav, and the list item under the nav. Let's see how this changes our markup. Okay, now we're getting somewhere, right? So we see here that we've set all of these to inline blocks. So now we're getting a little bit different behavior on how those links work. All right, so I want to set my background color, and it looks like it's not getting appropriately set. So we can use the Chrome inspector to see how our background color is getting messed up. And like our CSS validation tool, the Chrome inspector can give us some hints of invalid syntax that we're using in our CSS. In this case, if you noticed in my CSS, I forgot my semicolon here to separate between my color setting and my background color setting. So here, I can fix that. Notice my editor tries to help me out here. And let's see what happens to our text. Now we've got some additional work to do here. We can isolate all the anchor tags in our navigation and set our color to that nice blue that we have. And let's see if that helps things out. It does. So you can start to see how you can use CSS selections and CSS rules as a way to isolate specific elements for styling on your page. For example, if I want to remove the underline on these links, I can do so doing that way. Cool. Now, you may have seen on websites where you get kind of a hover behavior when you mouse over an anchor tag. Well, thankfully with CSS3, we can also use something called pseudo selectors. And pseudo selectors basically give us a way to decorate the behavior of particular elements. And in this case, we can use a pseudo selector for anchor tags when we mouse over them to basically define that when we mouse over them, we want to apply the text decoration underline. And this CSS rule is going to have one order of specificity higher than this one. So this is going to take over when I mouse over the anchor tag inside my nav. Pretty cool, right? So we can use pseudo selectors to basically isolate special behaviors and special elements or special states of elements in our HTML web page. And I recommend you check out MDN and read up on all the different pseudo selectors that you can use. But by far, one of the most frequent is that hover pseudo selector. Cool. All right, so let's talk a little bit about naming. If you look, in my classes and in my IDs, I have used semantic naming conventions as a way to isolate components of my HTML web page. I didn't call this blue. I didn't call this main header, right? So I didn't give a hint of the CSS styling that I wanted to apply, and I didn't give a hint as to the semantic element that's being used. In general, when you're naming your classes and your IDs, you want to come up with names that represent what the element actually represents, as opposed to the specifics of how you're treating the CSS or how you're actually documenting it as an HTML element. The other thing I want to call attention to is notice that by convention, I'm using all lowercase characters. And if I had multiple words that I wanted to incorporate in either my IDs or my classes, I'd separate them with hyphens. And it's super, super important just in general as a developer, particularly in front-end development, to be consistent with your naming conventions. So we wouldn't want to have this and then have this, right? These are two different conventions for basically describing our classes in our IDs. So make sure that you establish a convention and you stick to it. There's not necessarily any hard and fast rule that you need to attach to this, but you do want to remain consistent for the duration and entirety of your HTML documents and your HTML projects. So we covered a lot in this lesson. Again, just to kind of recap, in general, moving forward, you want to be applying your style rules inside a style element that exists inside your head tag. And that's going to inform all of the styling rules for the entirety of your HTML document. You can use different types of selectors to isolate different pieces of your HTML web page, starting with ID based selectors and going all the way down to element based selectors in wildcard class-based selectors. You can start to play around with the specificity or cascading nature of CSS. Also important to mention, we covered things like direct descendant selectors. We covered conjugated CSS rules using commas. And we also talked about pseudo selectors. So you want to make sure that you understand all of these concepts before we move into the next lesson. And on Thursday, we're going to be jumping into the box model. And the box model is going to blow your mind. We're going to be doing crazy things with the box model. We've got a lot to cover on that episode. So make sure this is a great time to kind of check in with yourself and ensure that you understand all the concepts involved. And if you have any questions, as always, I'm available to you on Slack as well as your fellow coders. I hope to see you on Thursday and keep grinding away at it. I know you can do it.